The cigar had gone cold between Dante Voss's fingers when the sheriff's deputy pushed through the door of his private booth at Luminara, trailing mud and the sharp scent of rain-soaked pine. Inside the evidence bag in the deputy's trembling hand, a phone glowed with an incoming call, Vivienne's ringtone, the melody Dante had chosen himself 6 months ago. "Found it 2 hours ago in Harwick Woods," the deputy said, his voice strained. "Still ringing when we arrived. Batteries at 12%. Been going for approximately 7 hours based on the call log." 7 hours. The last time Dante had seen Vivienne was at 3:30 p.m. 7.5 hours ago, standing in her studio doorway, paint on her cheek. She'd studied journalism before pursuing fine art, bringing investigative rigor to her artistic practice, which made her observations sharper than most. She'd told him she'd see him at dinner. He'd been running late for a meeting about territory disputes in the waterfront district, the kind of business that couldn't wait. She'd started calling at 3:47 p.m., 4 calls in rapid succession during that meeting. He'd silenced his phone each time, watching her name flash across the screen. The 4th call had come during the negotiations' critical moment. He'd declined it manually, sending her to voicemail. That was 7 hours ago. Where exactly? The words scraped past the tightness in his throat. Eastern Trail in Harwick Woods, 3 miles from the trailhead parking area. Hiker called it in. Just lying there in the middle of the path. Face up, ringing. No sign of struggle. No blood. Just the phone. Through the plastic evidence bag, Dante could see Vivienne's phone case, deep burgundy leather he'd given her, embossed with her initials. VLM. Vivienne Lucia Moretti. The screen showed his contact photo, the one she'd taken secretly at the marina, him in profile against sunset, actually smiling. Below it, the call duration, 7 hours, 13 minutes and 42 seconds. His thumb moved without conscious thought, pressing against the plastic where the answer button glowed. The phone rang twice more before falling silent. Then, after exactly 30 seconds, it started ringing again. The automated redial app he'd installed months ago, programmed to retry every 30 seconds if the call wasn't answered. "If it's really important," he'd told her while setting it up, "it'll keep trying. That way I know it's urgent." A safety feature that had become a mechanical heart, beating with unanswered calls. "How many times has it rung?" Dante asked. The deputy consulted his notepad. "Based on the call log, we could access approximately 84 attempts. Pattern started at 3:47 p.m. She called 4 times manually within 15 minutes. After that, the automatic redial kicked in every 30 seconds. 84 times. Over 3 hours of attempted connections compressed into 7 hours of ringing, because he'd programmed the app to be persistent but not excessive 30-second intervals to preserve battery while maintaining urgency. Except he hadn't answered. Dante stood slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding with deliberate control. Around them, Luminara continued its evening service, oblivious. The dinner crowd laughed and clinked glasses, celebrating promotions and anniversaries, living lives where the worst thing was an overcooked steak. "I need everything," Dante said, his voice returning with the hard edge that made subordinates straighten. "Timeline, location details, photographs of the scene. Send them to my private server now." His head of security and operations, Marcus, materialized at his shoulder with the silent efficiency of someone who'd spent 15 years reading his boss's moods. The older man's jaw was set in a hard line that meant violence was being assessed and calibrated. "The hiker?" Marcus asked economically. Gave a statement. "Tourist from Seattle. No connection to anyone local. She's at the precinct, but she's not a suspect. Just unlucky enough to find it." Dante reached for the evidence bag, and the deputy released it with obvious relief. The phone rang again in his hand, that automated persistence measuring his failure in 30-second intervals. "Batteries at 12%, the deputy reminded nervously. "Based on the drain rate, maybe 90 minutes before it dies completely. 90 minutes of ringing. 180 more opportunities to answer a call from a phone lying abandoned in the eastern woods while Vivienne was somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't see or protect her." The cigar smoke had dissipated, leaving only the faint smell of tobacco and the sharper scent of his own fear, metallic and unfamiliar. Dante Voss didn't do fear. He was the thing other people feared. the name whispered as warning in backrooms and boardrooms. But none of that mattered when the one person who'd seen past his armor was missing, and all that remained was a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. "Get me everything," he repeated, his hand closing around the evidence bag until the plastic crinkled. "I want names of everyone in those woods today. I want backgrounds. Before sunrise." The deputy fled, grateful for dismissal. The phone rang again, marking time. Somewhere in this city, Vivienne was waiting, hoping he'd figure it out before the battery died and her electronic lifeline went silent forever. He'd failed her once today by choosing business over her desperate calls. He wouldn't fail again. The drive to Harwick Woods took 23 minutes through rain that turned the world into a blur of shadow and reflected lights. Marcus drove with focused intensity while Dante sat in the passenger seat with Vivienne's phone still ringing every 30 seconds, each cycle a reminder of hours wasted, discussing shipping routes and profit percentages. His own phone showed the voicemails he'd been avoiding. 4 messages from those first 17 minutes when she'd called manually. He pressed play on the first one. Static. Then her voice, tight with something between fear and determination. "Dante, I need you to pick up. Right now. This is..." The message cut off abruptly, mid-sentence. Second message. "It's me again. I know you're in a meeting, but this can't wait. I found something. At the studio. I found..." Another sharp cut, accompanied by a sound like a door opening. Third message. Her breathing, heavy and quick, like she was moving fast. Background noise, traffic, wind. "I'm heading west toward Cascade Falls. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm meeting someone who can explain everything. If you get this in the next hour, call me back. If you don't..." A pause, long enough, he thought the message was over. Then, "If you don't, look for the painting, the one I wouldn't show you. You'll understand." Fourth message. Just breathing. 10 seconds, ragged and scared. Then a whisper. "I love you. Whatever happens, I need you to know that I love you." The messages ended. Dante stared at his phone's dark screen, rain running down the window beside him though they were inside the car. She'd known. Whatever she'd walked into, she'd known it was dangerous. And she'd come anyway, trying to reach him, trying to warn him, leaving breadcrumbs in case she couldn't. The painting. The one she'd kept covered in her studio for months, saying it wasn't ready. Whatever she'd found was documented there. She had that investigative instinct from her journalism training, that need to document and understand before acting. "We're going to the studio after this," Dante said. "Whatever she found, it's recorded there." The GPS announced their arrival at Harwick Woods' eastern trailhead. The path into the forest was marked with evidence tape and orange flags, bright against the dark mass of trees. Dante walked quickly, Marcus following, both moving with purposeful strides of men who'd navigated worse terrain in worse weather. 3 miles in, bearing left at both forks marked by the sheriff's department, until the evidence markers appeared small orange flags on thin metal stakes, creating a perimeter around a stretch of trail that looked exactly like every other stretch. The phone's location was marked with white spray paint already beginning to wash away in the rain. "Face up in the middle of the path," the deputy had said, as if placed rather than dropped. Dante knelt, his pants immediately soaking through at the knees, and examined the ground. No scuff marks from a struggle. No disturbed vegetation on either side of the trail. No blood, no torn fabric, no signs of violence. Just the circle where the phone had been, and 3 feet away a single shoe print. Not a hiking boot or running shoe. A dress shoe with smooth sole and distinctive heel pattern. Someone else was here, Marcus observed. Someone in dress shoes, not hiking gear. Dante photographed the print with his phone. Vivienne had been wearing running shoes, new ones, white with teal accents. But someone else had stood here, 3 feet from where her phone was found, in footwear completely inappropriate for a forest trail. The phone in the evidence bag rang again, right on its 30-second schedule. Dante pulled it out despite Marcus's protest about contaminating evidence and pressed answer through the plastic. Silence. Not dead air, but the particular quality of someone present on the other end, but not speaking. Then, faint but unmistakable water, the steady rush of moving water over rocks, constant and rhythmic, and beneath it, metallic creaking. hinges or chains swaying in wind. "Vivienne?" His voice cracked on her name. "Vivienne? Can you hear me?" The rushing water continued. The creaking. Then, just before the connection died, a voice. Not Vivienne's. Too distorted by distance or interference to identify, but definitely human, saying words he couldn't quite make out. The line went dead. Call duration: 47 seconds. Battery now at 9%. Someone had answered, which meant the phone wasn't just abandoned, it was being monitored. Someone was waiting for him to call, waiting for him to find it, waiting for him to come looking. This wasn't an accident. It was theater, a performance staged for an audience of one. His phone vibrated. Text from unknown number. "You found the phone. Good. Now find her. She's on the western side of Harwick Woods, where water meets stone and metal remembers. The old mill at Cascade Falls. Batteries at 9%. Clock's ticking. 9%. Maybe 70 minutes before the phone died completely. Cascade Falls. The abandoned mill site on the western edge of Harwick Woods, accessible from a different entrance 3 miles away by road. Where water met stone and rusted logging equipment, stood from decades past, metal that remembered. She'd said she was heading west toward the falls in her voicemail. She was there, had been there all along, while her phone was planted 3 miles away on the eastern trail to draw him out, to test him, to make him search. "It's a trap," Marcus said, reading the text over his shoulder. "I know." Dante was already moving back down the trail toward the car. "But she's there, and I'm going." Because he'd chosen a meeting over her calls once today. He wouldn't choose safety over her life. The phone rang again in his hand. 30 seconds had passed. Time was running out. The drive toward Cascade Falls gave Dante 20 minutes to remember why this mattered more than survival, more than strategy, more than the structure of power he'd spent 15 years building. He'd been 12 when he learned that love and violence often traveled together. His mother had been an ER nurse, working doubles, while his father, he barely thought of the man by that title, drank and raged and broke things, including her. She'd tried to leave once, planned meticulously, saved money, and arranged housing with family in another state. His father had discovered the hidden cash on a Friday night. Dante had been at a friend's house deliberately, because his mother had wanted him gone. He'd gotten the call at 10 p.m. His mother was in the hospital where she worked, but this time as a patient. 3 broken ribs, fractured jaw, internal bleeding requiring emergency surgery. She'd survived, but something else had broken that night that couldn't be fixed, her belief that escape was possible, that better options existed. She'd stayed after that. Stopped planning, stopped hoping, just endured. Dante had been 17 when he'd killed his father. Not planned, just a Thursday night when the old man had come home drunk and mean, and Dante had finally been big enough, angry enough, done enough with watching his mother flinch every time a door opened. No charges had been filed. The neighborhood had known what went on in that house. Nobody was sorry to see it end. His mother had looked at him with gratitude mixed with grief, understanding that her son had saved her life by destroying his own innocence. She'd never forgiven herself for that. Neither had he. Antonio Ravenna had found him 2 years later, 19 and angry, working security at a nightclub and getting into fights with the kind of regularity that suggested he was looking for violence to fill the hollow space his father's death had left behind. Antonio had recognized something useful intelligence and rage that could be shaped into either weapon or leader, depending on the hand doing the shaping. "You're wasting your potential here," Antonio had said, buying him a drink. "Come work for me. I'll teach you how to use that anger productively." For 8 years, Antonio had been the father. Dante never had teaching him the business, showing him how power really worked, explaining that violence was a language with grammar and syntax. Under Antonio's guidance, Dante had transformed from angry kid into force of nature, building reputation and resources, becoming someone others feared and respected. The break had come when Dante realized Antonio's lessons had darker purpose. His mentor wasn't grooming a successor, he was creating a weapon to use against rivals and dispose of when it became inconvenient. The revelation had come during a meeting where Antonio had casually ordered Dante to eliminate a man who turned out to be innocent, a setup designed to remove someone threatening while testing Dante's blind loyalty. Dante had done it. Then spent 3 months systematically destroying Antonio's organization from within, turning allies into enemies, and exposing corruption, redirecting resources until his mentor had been left with nothing but ruins and a price on his head that forced him to flee the state. 5 years of silence. No contact, no conflict, no sign that Antonio still had resources or will to strike back, until tonight. Now Antonio was back, and he'd found the perfect weapon the woman Dante loved, used as bait to force him into the same impossible choice his mother had faced: endure or resist, survive or fight back. His mother had chosen wrong, had accepted violence as inevitable rather than resistible. She'd survived, but survival had cost her everything that made it worthwhile. Dante wouldn't make that choice. He'd rather die trying than live with the knowledge he'd abandoned Vivienne when she needed him most. The entrance to Cascade Falls appeared on his left rusted chain hanging between concrete posts, graffiti-covered warning signs about structural instability. Beyond it, somewhere in the gloom and rain, Vivienne was waiting. He wouldn't fail her the way others had failed his mother. The phone rang again, battery at 7%. Dante turned onto the access road and drove forward into shadow. But first, the studio. Because Vivienne had told him to look for the painting, and ignoring her messages once today had already cost too much. Dante changed course, Marcus following without question. The Pearl District studio was 20 minutes away, time they couldn't afford, but information mattered as much as speed. Walking into Antonio's trap blind was suicide. The building's security recognized Dante immediately, buzzing him through despite the late hour, and his disheveled appearance, mud-caked pants, soaked shirt, hair plastered to his skull from rain. The elevator carried them up with mechanical groans that echoed in the empty shaft. The studio door was unlocked. She never locked it during daytime, said it blocked creative flow. Inside was controlled chaos. Canvases leaning against walls, paint-splattered drop cloths covering the floor, mason jars filled with brushes on every surface. The air was thick with oil paint and linseed oil, familiar and somehow comforting. But something felt wrong, too neat. Things had been moved, straightened, arranged. Someone had been here recently, and it wasn't Vivienne. There, Marcus said quietly, nodding toward the far corner, where a large easel stood, canvas covered with a paint-stained cloth, the painting she wouldn't show him. Dante crossed the studio and pulled the covering away. What lay beneath made his blood run cold. It was a map. Not conventional, but artistic interpretation rendered in Vivienne's distinctive style, hyperrealism blended with surrealism, the technique she'd perfected during her journalism days when she'd specialized in data visualization before switching to fine art. At the center, Luminara, his restaurant, rendered in exquisite detail. From there, lines radiated outward like spokes on a wheel, each connecting to another location. The shipping warehouse where he moved legitimate goods. The private club where city council members met for off-books negotiations. The construction company that provided cover for certain operations. The accounting firm that kept careful records. Every location was connected by those radiating lines, and along each line, Vivienne had painted tiny details, dates, amounts, names in her precise artistic hand, an organizational chart of his entire operation, showing connections even his inner circle didn't know about. But that wasn't the disturbing part. At the edges, like shadows creeping from corners, were faces. A dozen of them, painted in darker palette that made them seem to emerge from the canvas itself. He recognized some. Rival operators, federal agents who'd been trying to build cases against him for years, politicians who'd publicly campaigned on cleaning up organized crime while privately accepting his contributions. And there, in the lower right corner, almost hidden among shadows, Antonio Ravenna. His former mentor was back, and somehow, impossibly, Vivienne had known about it. How? Marcus breathed beside him. How could she have known all this? Dante's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had she been investigating him? Working with law enforcement? Then he saw it. In the very center, where all lines converged at Luminara, Vivienne had painted two figures. One was him, rendered perfectly down to the scar above his left eyebrow. The other was a woman, not Vivienne herself, but someone else. Sharp features, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a gray business suit. A woman holding Vivienne's hand, both looking directly out at the viewer with expressions conveying warning and apology. At the bottom, a single line of text. The truth costs everything, but so does silence. His phone vibrated with a text from unknown number. You found the painting. Good. Now you understand she was trying to protect you. But she saw too much, and they couldn't let that stand. Batteries at 6%. Come to where water meets stone and metal remembers. Alone. Or she dies when the phone does. 6%. Maybe 50 minutes. She wasn't investigating me, Dante said slowly, understanding crystallizing. She was investigating them. The people at the edges, the ones moving in on my territory. She overheard something, saw something, and instead of running, she documented it, to warn me. A message arrived with an image attachment surveillance photo of Vivienne's studio. Date. Stamped 3 weeks ago. Someone had been watching her, documenting her investigation of them. She found their surveillance, Marcus said, pointing to another photo showing Vivienne examining something behind a canvas. That's what she meant in the voicemail. She found cameras, their documentation of you and her. The pieces assembled themselves. Vivienne had discovered she was under surveillance 3 weeks ago, had investigated why, using those investigative skills from her journalism background, the training that had taught her to follow threads and document patterns. She'd traced it back to Antonio's return and his new organization. She'd been documenting everything she learned in the only language she spoke fluently, art that revealed uncomfortable truths. The painting wasn't evidence against Dante. It was evidence for him, a gift, a warning, a map to understanding the threat, and he'd been too busy with meetings to receive it. Antonio had used her investigation against her, turning her curiosity into bait for an elaborate trap. Another message. Battery at 5%. She's asking for you. Wants to know if you're coming. What should I tell her? She was alive, conscious, still fighting, still hoping he'd figure it out in time. Cascade Falls, Dante said, already moving toward the door. Now, but Marcus positioned the team a mile back. If Antonio sees anyone but me, he'll kill her just to make a point. Boss, going alone is not negotiable. She's there because I sent her to voicemail, because I chose business over her desperate attempt to warn me about the threats she'd uncovered. Dante's voice carried finality. I'm going, and I'm going alone, because that's the only chance she has. Marcus looked at the painting one more time. All those connections, all that documentation of threats Vivienne had identified while trying to protect someone she loved. She's brave. She's terrified, Dante corrected. But brave anyway. Now let's make sure that bravery wasn't wasted. They left the studio, the painting remaining as testimony to everything Vivienne had tried to communicate, everything he'd been too distracted to hear. She'd mapped the threat, identified the danger, and tried to save him from something he hadn't known was coming. Now it was his turn to save her. The phone rang again. Battery at 5%. 40 minutes, maybe less. Dante drove through rain toward Cascade Falls on the western edge of Harwick Woods, toward the abandoned mill where water met stone and metal remembered, toward whatever ending Antonio had orchestrated. Behind them, the painting waited a map of connections and consequences. Art transformed into intelligence, love expressed through warning. He wouldn't ignore her message this time. The abandoned mill emerged from shadow like a monument to failure, 3 stories of crumbling brick and broken windows, silhouetted against clouds that reflected the distant city's glow. The structure stood at the western edge of Harwick Woods, where Cascade Falls sent water plunging 40 feet into a pool that had once been used for log floating. But it was the crane that held Dante's attention, massive equipment that had once loaded lumber onto trucks, now rusted and skeletal against the night sky. The crane's arm extended out over the falls, positioned where water cascaded down the rocky drop. From the crane's arm hung a chain. At the end of that chain was a cage improvised construction of welded rebar, the kind used for moving materials in industrial settings where safety was a suggestion rather than requirement. Inside the cage was Vivienne. Even from 100 yards away, Dante recognized her silhouette the way she held herself. Upright despite obvious exhaustion, the defiant set of her shoulders, the refusal to show defeat. She was alive, conscious, waiting. Relief hit him like a physical blow, so intense it nearly drove him to his knees. Touching, isn't it? The voice came from behind, cultured, amused, exactly as Dante remembered it. The way she's maintained her dignity throughout this ordeal. I can see why you chose her. She's stronger than the others you've been with. Dante turned slowly, hands visible and empty. Antonio Ravenna stood beneath an outbuilding's overhang, sheltered from rain, flanked by two men Dante didn't recognize. His former mentor had aged in 5 years, gray, streaking dark hair, lines deepening around eyes and mouth. But his posture was still that of a predator, and his smile still carried the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed inflicting suffering. Antonio? Dante kept his voice neutral, conversational. I thought you'd learned your lesson about coming back to my city. Your city? Antonio laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. That's the problem right there. You started believing your own mythology. This was never your city. It was mine. I built it, controlled it, and when I decided to teach you the business, you somehow confused being given temporary authority with actually owning something. You lost 5 years ago. Stay gone, or I'll finish what I started. Oh, I don't think you're in a position to threaten anyone tonight. Antonio gestured toward the crane, toward Vivienne's cage suspended 40 feet above churning water. You see, I've learned some things in our time apart. Threatening you directly doesn't work. You're too comfortable with violence, too willing to gamble with your own life. But threaten something you actually care about? He smiled wider. Different equation entirely. Dante forced himself not to look at Vivienne again, not to show Antonio how deeply the fear was cutting. What do you want? Want? I want to watch. You suffer. I want you to understand what it feels like to have everything taken away piece by piece. Antonio stepped forward into rain, letting it soak into his expensive coat. But more practically, I want my city back, my organization, my respect, and you're going to give it to me. By what mechanism? Simple. Antonio pulled out a phone, Vivienne's phone, its screen glowing with 2% battery remaining. This charming device has been ringing for hours, trying to reach you. Battery's at 2% now. When it dies, the signal stops transmitting to the relay system I've set up. What relay? Antonio gestured at the crane with obvious pride. The chain holding your girlfriend's cage threads through an electromagnet powered by a car battery. As long as my relay receives the signal from this phone, power flows to the magnet and the chain is held secure. When the power cuts, when the phone dies and stops transmitting, the electromagnet releases. He paused, letting that sink in. The cage falls 40 feet into water, churning over rocks. Even an excellent swimmer would struggle to survive that. And she's locked inside a metal box that will sink like a stone. The setup was elegant in its cruelty, and completely on brand for Antonio. He'd always preferred mechanisms to direct action, enjoyed creating situations where victims' circumstances led to their own destruction. So here's my offer, Antonio continued. You kneel, right here, right now. You call your inner circle. I know you have Marcus on speed dial, and you tell them that Antonio Ravenna is in charge now, that they answer to me. You dismantle everything you've built and hand it over, piece by piece, while I watch. Do all that, and when the phone dies, I'll manually override the relay. Your girlfriend lives. You get to live with the knowledge that you saved her, by destroying yourself. Dante assessed Antonio, really assessed him, seeing past theatrical cruelty to wounded pride beneath. This wasn't about business or territory. This was about a man who couldn't accept that his student had surpassed him, who needed to reassert dominance to salvage his fractured ego. The smart play would be to agree, kneel, make calls, buy time, while Marcus's team moved into position. Surrender could be temporary, retaken later when the immediate crisis had passed. But Dante hadn't survived 15 years by being predictable. No, he said simply. Antonio's smile flickered. You understand the consequences? When that phone dies, I understand perfectly. You're going to kill her regardless of what I do. That's how you operate. You're not offering a trade, you're offering humiliation followed by murder. The only variable is whether I destroy myself first to buy her a few extra minutes. Dante took a step forward, watching Antonio's guards tense, So no, I won't kneel. I won't call anyone. I won't give you the satisfaction of breaking me before you kill what I love. Then she dies, Antonio said, his voice hardening. In approximately, he checked the phone's battery indicator, 5 minutes when this device finally gives up its ghost. You could have saved her, Dante. Remember that. This death is on your conscience, not mine. Her death would be on my conscience either way, Dante said quietly. At least this way. I don't compound it by becoming the thing she'd hate me for being. She knew what I was when she chose me. She understood the risks. But she also believed I was better than you. Stronger. More principled in my own twisted way. I won't prove her wrong in her final minutes. He pulled his gun in one smooth motion, the weapon appearing in his hand with practiced ease. Antonio's guards moved simultaneously, their own weapons drawn and aimed, creating a three-way standoff in the rain. Shoot me and my men shoot you, Antonio said calmly, seemingly unbothered by the escalation. We all die, and the phone dies with us. She still falls. True, Dante, acknowledged. But you die first. That's worth something. Is it? I thought you'd evolved beyond simple revenge. Antonio's tone was mocking, but Dante could see calculation in his eyes, the realization that he'd miscalculated his former student's psychology. The phone in Antonio's hand vibrated a low battery warning, the death rattle of a device that had served faithfully for hours beyond its expected endurance. 2%. Maybe 4 minutes remaining. Last chance, Antonio said. Put down the gun. Make the calls. Save her. Dante's finger rested against the trigger, the familiar weight of the weapon centering him in the moment. I'm going to tell you something, Antonio. Something you never understood because you were always too focused on control and dominance to see the bigger picture. The reason I beat you 5 years ago wasn't because I was smarter or more ruthless. It was because the people who worked for you were terrified. They stayed loyal out of fear. And the moment that fear shifted to someone else to me, they abandoned you instantly. Your point? Antonio's patience was wearing thin. My point is that I built something different. The people who work for me aren't terrified, they're invested. They believe in what we're building, even if it's morally complicated. Marcus isn't waiting a mile away because I ordered it. He's waiting because he understands that some situations require trust over intervention. And when this is over, regardless of how it ends, he'll finish what needs to be finished. Not because I commanded it, but because it's the right move strategically. Dante shifted his aim slightly, no longer pointing directly at Antonio but at the phone in his hand. So here's my counter-offer. You can shoot me, and I'll shoot that phone. Your relay loses its signal early, the cage falls, and we all die in this mutual destruction you've orchestrated. Or you can accept that your revenge fantasy isn't going to end the way you scripted it, and we can discuss alternatives before that battery hits zero. There are no alternatives, Antonio said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. There are always alternatives. You just have to be creative enough to see them. Dante risked a glance toward the crane, his mind racing through mechanical principles and structural realities. That electromagnet you're so proud of, it's powered by a car battery, you said, which means there's a physical power source somewhere that can be disconnected. Why do you care? Because I'm trying to decide if I can get to it faster than you can shoot me. And if the mechanism is as elegant as you clearly think it is, or if you've overcomplicated things the way you always did. Dante smiled without humor. Remember the Santini contract? You wanted to send a message, so you set up that elaborate scene with the chandelier and the timing mechanism. Would have been impressive, except the mechanism failed and Santini escaped, and your message became a joke instead of a warning. Antonio's face flushed with anger at the reminder of his most public failure. This is different. This is perfected. Is it? Because I'm seeing a lot of variables. Old equipment that's been rusting for decades. Electromagnets that rely on consistent power in a rainstorm. Relay systems that could fail for a dozen reasons. You've built something theatrical, which means you've built something fragile. One variable breaks, and your entire revenge fantasy collapses. It was all bravado, psychological warfare designed to plant doubt. Dante had no idea if the system was fragile or robust, but he'd learned long ago that confidence was its own kind of weapon. The phone vibrated again. 1%, 3 minutes, maybe less. And then, from the cage suspended over the falls, a voice carried through the storm. "Dante, the crane controls southwest corner of the main building. I saw them bring up the cage." Vivienne, breaking her silence at the critical moment, giving him information, even though drawing attention to herself was dangerous. Antonio turned toward her voice, and in that momentary distraction, Dante made his choice. Not the smart choice or the safe choice, but the only choice that gave him any chance of saving the woman he loved. He ran, not toward Antonio or his guards, but toward the southwest corner of the main building, toward the crane controls Vivienne had spotted. Gunfire erupted behind him, 3 shots, 4, the sound sharp against the constant white noise of the falls. He felt one round pass close enough to his head that it disturbed his hair. Another impacted the brick wall ahead, spraying fragments that stung his cheek. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because Vivienne had given him a chance, and he'd failed her once today already. The crane controls were housed in a metal box mounted to the building's exterior, protected by a padlock that looked newer than the surrounding structure. Antonio's addition, presumably. Dante raised his gun and shot the lock off, the metal shattering under close-range impact. Behind him, he heard Antonio shouting orders, heard running footsteps approaching. He had maybe 10 seconds before they reached him. Inside the control box was a nightmare of corroded switches and jury-rigged wiring, modern components spliced into antique systems. The electromagnet relay was easy to spot, a car battery connected to a wireless receiver, surprisingly professional-looking compared to the vintage crane controls surrounding it. Dante grabbed the wiring and pulled, disconnecting the relay from its power source. The effect was immediate and exactly what he'd feared. Without power, the electromagnet released its hold, and Vivienne's cage began to fall. Time seemed to slow, the way it did in moments of extreme crisis when the brain accelerated its processing to capture every detail. Dante watched the cage drop through his peripheral vision, saw Vivienne inside bracing in herself, and saw the churning water 40 feet below ready to receive her. He'd made a terrible, fatal mistake. But then the cage jerked to a halt after falling only 6 feet, caught by something unexpected. Dante's eyes tracked upward and saw it. A secondary safety chain, shorter than the electromagnet's primary chain, installed as backup, and now holding the cage suspended approximately 34 feet above the water instead of 40. Antonio's voice behind him was choked with rage. "You stupid, that was a backup safety chain. It was never supposed to engage. I disabled it specifically so the cage would fall completely." Dante didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and shot Antonio's phone, the one with 1% battery that had been counting down to Vivienne's death. The device exploded in Antonio's hand, plastic and glass and circuitry scattering across the muddy ground. The screen went dark, its glow extinguished. The persistent ringing that had marked the past 7 hours finally stopped. In the sudden silence that followed, punctuated only by rain and rushing water, Dante and Antonio stared at each other across 15 feet of muddy ground. Antonio's expression cycled through shock, rage, and finally a bitter understanding. "You've just started a war," Antonio said quietly, cradling his hand where plastic fragments had cut the palm. "No," Dante replied, his gun still raised and steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm finishing one you started 5 years ago and were too proud to accept was over." The sound of vehicles approaching multiple engines at high speed cut through the night. Marcus, bringing reinforcements, no longer willing to wait while the sound of gunfire echoed through the woods. Antonio's guards looked at their boss, at Dante, at the approaching lights, calculating their odds and finding them poor. One of them slowly lowered his weapon. The other followed after a moment's hesitation. "This isn't over," Antonio said. But they both knew it was. He'd gambled everything on one perfect revenge, and it had collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. "Yes," Dante said with finality. "It is." He kept his gun trained on Antonio while calling out toward the crane. "Vivienne, I'm going to lower you down. Stay still and stay calm." Her voice came back, shaky now that the immediate crisis was passing. "Anytime you're ready would be great." Despite everything, the terror, the violence, the barely averted tragedy, Dante found himself smiling. She was alive. They were alive. And whatever came next, They'd face it, having chosen integrity over expedience, even when the cost had nearly been everything. He moved to the crane controls, evaluating the vintage mechanisms and modern additions, figuring out how to safely lower the cage while Marcus's team flooded the area with tactical precision. Within moments, Antonio and his men were secured, not arrested, but contained in a way that would lead to more permanent resolution later, the kind that left no loose ends or opportunities for future revenge. The cage descended slowly toward solid ground, one measured foot at a time. As it touched down with a metallic thud, Marcus was there immediately, breaking the lock with bolt cutters and helping Vivienne out. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from hours of forced immobility in the cramped cage, and then she was walking toward Dante, then running despite the stiffness, then collapsing into his arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. He held her while she shook, held her while the fear she'd been suppressing for 8 hours finally found release, held her while rain fell, and his empire teetered, and the consequences of tonight's choices began calculating themselves in the background of his mind. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair, the words inadequate but necessary. "I should have answered. I should have—" "Shut up," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You came. You chose right. That's what matters." And maybe she was correct. Maybe in the end, the only thing that mattered was whether you showed up when it counted, whether you chose love over fear, whether you became the person someone believed you could be instead of the person circumstances tried to make you. Dante held Vivienne while his team secured the scene, while Antonio was led away to face consequences that would be final and permanent, while the rain finally began to ease and the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. He'd started this night at a restaurant table, living his carefully constructed life of power and control. He'd end it here, in the ruins of an abandoned mill, holding the woman he loved and understanding finally that control had always been an illusion. The only thing real was the choice you made when everything else fell apart, and he'd chosen her, would choose her again, would keep choosing her for as long as she'd let him, consequences and complications, and all. 3 days after Cascade Falls, Dante stood in Vivienne's studio watching her add final touches to the painting. Despite the occasional nightmare that had her waking in a cold sweat, remembering the cage and the water, she'd been working through the trauma in therapy and through her art. She'd updated the painting, Antonio's shadowed figure now faded, marked with a red X. But she'd added something new. Another face in the center, female and sharp, featured, painted with unsettling precision. "Who's that?" Dante asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "I don't know yet, but she's important." Vivienne stepped back, evaluating her work with critical distance. "I found more surveillance photos hidden in the studio after we got back. Different angle, different camera. Someone else was watching, documenting Antonio's operation and ours simultaneously." Before Dante could respond, his phone chimed. Marcus, sounding tense in a way that immediately elevated Dante's concern. "Boss, we have a situation. Antonio has been dealt with permanently as planned, but one of his men is nervous and willing to trade. Peter Rothman, worked security 5 years ago, followed Antonio out of state. He's willing to give us everything for witness protection and a clean exit." "What's he saying?" "Antonio's operation here was small, maybe a dozen people total, but they're connected to a larger network operating out of Nevada. The Caldero family, mid-level players controlling about 15% of the Las Vegas market, and the person running point for them," Marcus paused. "Former federal prosecutor named Isadora Vex, 32 years old, burned out, and went private sector in the worst possible way. She's been restructuring their entire operation to be litigation-proof." Dante absorbed this, his understanding of the situation shifting. So last night was reconnaissance as much as revenge. Exactly. And boss? Rothman says Isa was, watching the whole thing remotely. Antonio had convinced him that documenting his revenge would prove the success of their strategy, so he'd agreed to let her plant cameras at the mill site. She monitored the confrontation in real time, saw you take down Antonio, saw how you handled the situation under pressure. Rothman thinks she's impressed. That was deeply concerning. Being noticed by a criminal strategist who appreciated competence meant becoming either a potential partner or a priority threat. Given that he'd just eliminated her operations figurehead, partnership seemed unlikely. "Send me everything you have on Isadora Vex." The file arrived within minutes, a comprehensive dossier Marcus's team had assembled with impressive speed. Isadora Vex's story read like a case study in disillusionment and radicalization. Top of her class at Yale Law School. 5 years with the Southern District of New York Prosecutor's Office, maintaining a 92% conviction rate on cases that actually made it to trial. But increasingly, her cases hadn't made it to trial. Defense attorneys with unlimited resources would bury her in motions and paperwork until witnesses disappeared or evidence became inadmissible through procedural technicalities. Her final case had been against a financial executive who'd defrauded thousands of retirees out of their pension funds. Isa had spent 2 years building what should have been an airtight case, only to watch it collapse when a key witness died in a suspicious accident and documentary evidence vanished from a supposedly secure evidence locker. The executive had walked free with a smile. Isa had resigned within a week. 6 months later, she'd resurfaced as a strategic consultant for the Caldero family, applying her prosecutorial skills to identifying and exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement investigations. Under her guidance, the Calderos' arrest rate had dropped 70% while their revenue had increased 40%. "She's going to come after us," Vivienne said, analyzing the file over his shoulder. "Not immediately, not while she's processing what happened to Antonio, but eventually, she'll see you as the person who killed her project, who proved her strategy had flaws. People like her don't accept failure. They study it and adapt." Agreed. Dante was already thinking 3 moves ahead, considering options and consequences. "The question is whether we wait for her to move or whether we strike preemptively." His phone vibrated. Text from an unknown number. "Interesting performance at the Falls. We should talk. I have video documentation of the confrontation that could be problematic for you, but I prefer partnership to prosecution. Las Vegas, this week. Come prepared to negotiate. IV." The threat was clear and sophisticated. Cooperate or face exposure. Video footage of the mill site could be framed as murder rather than self-defense, giving prosecutors the kind of evidence they could rebuild cases around. "She's giving you a binary choice," Vivienne observed, reading over his shoulder. "Partnership or prosecution, but binary choices are negotiation tactics, not actual limitations." Meaning? Meaning there are always alternatives if parties are creative enough. You could go to Vegas, but not on her timeline. Show up early, disrupt her strategy, and demonstrate you're not intimidated by her leverage. It was risky, but strategically sound. Isa would expect him to spend days panicking, building defenses, looking for escape routes. Showing up immediately would put her on the defensive, force her to adapt to his timeline instead of executing her planned approach. "We fly to Vegas tomorrow," Dante decided. "Both of us." "Both?" "She's a woman in a male-dominated field, probably faces constant skepticism and challenges to her authority. Showing up with a female partner might create different dynamics than the typical macho posturing she's expecting." Vivienne considered this, then nodded. "I'll pack a bag. But Dante, we're walking into a meeting with someone who just demonstrated she's willing to use elaborate traps to achieve objectives. We need to be careful. Careful is all we can be, but doing nothing means playing defense in a game where she's already several moves ahead. I'd rather gamble on disrupting her strategy than wait to respond to whatever she's planned." The next morning, they flew to Las Vegas on Dante's private jet. Marcus had arranged for additional security, 4 team members instead of the usual 2, all of them alert and professional. The heightened presence was both reassuring and ominous. The city appeared below as they descended a monument to structured chaos, where billions of dollars flowed through carefully regulated channels designed to separate tourists from their money with mathematical precision. The Caldero building was downtown in the Fremont Street area, a renovated 1,960 seconds hotel, maintaining vintage neon exterior, while the interior had been gutted and rebuilt to modern standards. The lobby featured mid-century modern furniture and artwork that suggested someone with taste had been involved. The receptionist's professional smile faltered slightly when Dante walked in with Vivienne, his expensive suit and her elegant dress signaling they weren't typical visitors. "We don't have appointments available today," she began, but Dante cut her off by placing a business card on her desk, one of the legitimate ones from his real estate holdings. "Tell Isadora Vex that Dante Voss is here to discuss recent events at Cascade Falls. She'll want to take this meeting." The receptionist's expression shifted from polite dismissal to genuine alarm. She picked up a phone, spoke quietly for 30 seconds, and then hung up looking pale. "Miss Vex will see you. 10th floor, executive suite. The elevator requires a key card. I'll have someone escort you." The escort was a security officer built like a defensive lineman, all muscle and intimidation. He led them to an elevator that required both a key card and fingerprint scan technology that seemed excessive for a legitimate business but made perfect sense for an organization conducting activities they preferred to keep private. The 10th floor opened onto a corridor that managed to be both elegant and threatening: expensive art on the walls, plush carpet underfoot, but security cameras at every intersection and doors that were definitely reinforced despite their wood veneer. They were led to double doors at the corridor's end. The security officer knocked twice and waited. "Enter," called a female voice, cultured and confident. The executive suite beyond was large but not ostentatious floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Las Vegas. Contemporary furniture arranged for both comfort and conversation. Bookshelves lined with legal texts and philosophy, alongside literary fiction. Behind a glass desk sat Isadora Vex. She was younger than her 32 years suggested, could easily pass for late 20s. Dark hair cut in a sharp bob, minimal makeup, wearing a charcoal suit that was clearly expensive but not flashy. Her eyes were her most striking feature, intelligent and calculating, taking in both visitors with the evaluating gaze of someone who read people as instinctively as others read books. "Mr. Voss," she said, standing to offer a handshake that was firm but not aggressive. "And Miss Moretti, I presume? I've admired your work. The gallery show last fall was particularly impressive. Your use of color to convey emotional subtext was masterful. Please, sit." The civility was jarring after the violence of 3 nights ago. Isa offered refreshments, coffee, water, something stronger if preferred, with the grace of a host welcoming expected guests, rather than a criminal strategist receiving potential enemies. Dante and Vivienne sat in the chairs facing the desk, declining beverages. Every instinct Dante had was firing warnings this was too comfortable, too normal, designed to lower defenses and create false security. "I assume you know why we're here," Dante began, deciding to skip the verbal chess match and jump directly to substance. "I have theories," Isa replied, returning to her own chair with fluid grace. "You're here early 48 hours ahead of when I planned to contact you, which suggests you're either panicking or seeking to negotiate from weakness, or you're attempting to disrupt my timeline and seize initiative. Given your reputation and your performance at Cascade Falls, I'm betting on the latter." "Good bet. Let's talk about what happened there." "Let's." Isa pulled up a laptop, turning the screen so they could see it. The display showed frozen video footage from the mill site. Dante with his gun drawn, Antonio's men in various positions, Vivienne's cage suspended over the falls. The camera angle was wide and clear, capturing everything. "I have extensive documentation of the events. Antonio's elimination, your tactical response, even some lovely audio of your psychological warfare about his mechanical failures and past incompetence. It's quite the collection. And you're planning to use it as leverage for partnership terms," Dante said flatly. "Work with the Calderos on West Coast expansion or face exposure to law enforcement. Partnership or prosecution, a binary choice designed to force cooperation." Isa's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes. "You've done your homework on me. Impressive speed, actually. I only briefed Rothman yesterday morning, and he was supposed to be secure in Antonio's organization. How did you flip him so quickly?" "I offered him something better than what he had with a dead boss and a collapsing operation. Isn't that how all negotiations work? Find what someone values and provide it in exchange for what you need." "Fair point." Isa closed the laptop, the smile fading into something more serious. "So you understand the situation. You understand what I have and what I can do with it. The question becomes, why are you here instead of spending 2 days building your defense strategy? Because binary choices are a negotiation tactic, not an actual limitation, Dante replied. You presented partnership or exposure as the only options, but there are always alternatives if parties are willing to be creative. I'm here to discuss those alternatives. Such as mutual assured destruction. I have resources and information that could damage the Caldero operation significantly. You move against me with your video evidence. I move against you with what I know about your organization's vulnerabilities, and we both suffer losses that exceed any potential gains from this conflict. Classic deterrence through credible threat of unacceptable retaliation. Isa leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled thoughtfully. Go on. Or, we explore cooperation that doesn't require territorial concession. Information sharing about common threats, coordinated operations against mutual enemies, resource pooling for mutual benefit, without either party surrendering autonomy. A strategic alliance rather than a merger or hostile acquisition. Interesting. And the third option? We recognize that this entire situation arose from Antonio's personal vendetta, which had nothing to do with legitimate business interests. His operation failed. He's been permanently removed from the board, and the debt he owed has been settled with his life. The Calderos can absorb the loss and move on, or they can invest additional resources trying to avenge someone who was essentially a liability testing your strategic theories. Pure calculation suggests accepting the sunk cost and focusing on more profitable ventures. Isa was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable as she processed his proposals. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality, less performative, more genuine. You know what I appreciate about you, Mr. Voss? You don't insult my intelligence. Most men who walk into this office either try to intimidate or seduce, neither of which works on me. But you're treating this like an actual negotiation between professionals who respect each other's capabilities. I appreciate that approach. I respect competence, Dante replied. And you're clearly competent. The surveillance, the leverage, the strategic patience to let Antonio run his revenge play while documenting everything, it's all very well executed. But competence in service of the wrong objective is just sophisticated waste. The question we should both be asking is, what objective would actually serve our respective interests? Vivienne, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward slightly. May I ask a question? Isa's attention shifted to her, curiosity evident. Please. Why did you help Antonio? He was emotional, theatrical, driven by wounded ego. Everything you're apparently not, given your prosecutorial background and strategic approach. His revenge operation was tactically interesting but strategically questionable. You must have known he'd either succeed and become a volatile liability, or fail and reveal your involvement. So why invest Caldero resources in his personal vendetta? The question hung in the air, and Dante realized Vivienne had identified something crucial. He'd missed the fundamental incongruity in Isa's involvement. For someone supposedly calculating and strategic, supporting Antonio's revenge play made no sense unless there was a layer to this they hadn't seen yet. Isa's expression shifted to something approaching respect. That's the right question, the one nobody else has thought to ask. She stood, moving to the window where downtown Las Vegas spread below like a circuit board of lights and possibility. I helped Antonio because his failure was the point. Because I needed to test your organization's security, your personal vulnerabilities, your tactical response to unexpected crisis. Antonio was never meant to succeed. He was meant to force you to reveal capabilities and weaknesses we could document and analyze for future strategic planning. The admission landed like a physical blow. Everything, the cage, the electromagnetic relay, the elaborate theatrical setup, had been designed not to kill Vivienne, but to observe Dante's response under maximum pressure, to gather intelligence about how he operated when everything he valued was at stake. The 48-hour timeline you mentioned in your text, Dante said slowly, understanding crystallizing. That was never about letting me panic. It was about giving you time to analyze the data you collected at Cascade Falls. Correct. Your tactical response, your personal priorities, your willingness to gamble with your own life, your security team's capabilities under pressure, all of it documented, and currently being analyzed by people much smarter than me. about tactical operations. Isa turned back to face them. And you know what conclusion they reached? That you're not someone we should be fighting. You're someone we should be hiring. The pivot was so unexpected that Dante needed a moment to process it. Hiring. The Calderos are expanding not just geographically but operationally. We're moving into legitimate business sectors, using criminal profits to fund legal enterprises that will eventually become our primary revenue streams. Money laundering in reverse, you might say. But that transition requires expertise we don't currently have in-house. Isa returned to her desk, pulling up new documents on her laptop. You've successfully operated in both worlds, criminal and legitimate. Your real estate holdings are profitable and legally defensible. Your legitimate businesses employ hundreds of people and contribute positively to the local economy. You've managed to build something sustainable that can withstand scrutiny. And you? Want to replicate that model in Nevada. We want you to build it for us, consult on the transition, help structure operations that can withstand legal scrutiny, advice on legitimate business opportunities that align with our existing resources and capabilities, standard consulting contract, substantial compensation, completely legal and above board. Isa slid a document across the desk. This is the offer. Read it. Think about it. Discuss with your advisors. No pressure, no threats attached to this specific proposal. Just business. Dante picked up the document, scanning terms that were indeed attractive. 7 figures annually for advisory services, considerable performance bonuses tied to successful venture launches, complete indemnity for past actions on both sides. It was a legitimate contract, the kind that could be filed with the IRS and wouldn't raise red flags with financial regulators. It was also completely insane given recent events. You're asking me to help the organization that just tried to kill my girlfriend as part of an intelligence-gathering operation, Dante said carefully, watching Isa's reaction to the direct statement. I'm asking you to help an organization that's trying to evolve past the need for violence and elaborate tests, Isa corrected smoothly. Antonio's operation was old-school theatrical, personal, inefficient in resource allocation. Everything I'm working to move the Calderos away from. His failure proved my point to their leadership, that revenge plays and territory wars are expensive and counterproductive compared to investing in legitimate growth and strategic partnerships. Vivian was reading the contract over his shoulder, and Dante could feel her tension. This was sophisticated manipulation, reframing recent trauma as a regrettable learning experience, offering compensation that would be difficult to refuse, making it seem like refusing would be emotional rather than rational. I need time to think about this, Dante said, setting the contract down with deliberate care. Of course. Take a week. Discuss it with your people, your lawyers, anyone whose counsel you value. We're not going anywhere, and neither is the opportunity. Isa's phone chimed, and she glanced at it with a small frown. But before you go, there's one more thing you should know. Consider it context for your decision-making process. She turned the laptop screen again, this time showing different security footage, what appeared to be a police evidence room, time-stamped from earlier that morning. The footage showed someone entering the room, accessing a locker with practiced ease, and removing items that were clearly labeled as evidence from various cases. That's Detective Sarah Chen, Isa said quietly. Portland Police Department, assigned to Organized Crime Division for the past 8 years. She's been on the Calderos' payroll for 18 months. Feeding us information about investigations, sanitizing evidence that could be problematic, warning us about planned raids before they happen. And as of this morning, she's in possession of physical evidence from multiple cases involving your organization, evidence that could be used to build prosecutions if properly presented to authorities. Dante felt the cage tighten around him, not metal bars this time, but digital evidence and corrupt officials, and the systematic destruction of any path that didn't lead through Isa's carefully constructed doorway. The threat was clear and devastating. Accepting the consulting offer bought protection and partnership. Refusing it meant Detective Chen would suddenly discover all that evidence and enthusiastically build cases that would consume Dante's life for years, even if he ultimately beat the charges. That's insurance, Isa continued, her voice carrying neither apology nor aggression, just matter-of-fact explanation. in case you're thinking of using your own leverage against us in retaliation for the Cascade Falls operation. The video I showed you of Chen contaminating evidence? It's encrypted and backed up in multiple secure locations. If something happens to me, or to the Calderos if we're arrested, prosecuted, or otherwise neutralized, that video gets released automatically to Internal Affairs, along with documentation of every case Chen's touched in 18 months. She goes down for corruption, and she takes everyone she protected down with her, including you. The trap was complete, built from documentation, leverage, and the threat of mutually assured destruction if he didn't cooperate. Isa had planned multiple moves ahead, accounting for various responses, building redundant systems of control. 1 week, he said, standing with Vivienne. We'll review the contract and discuss internally. That's all I ask. Isa stood as well, offering her hand again in that same firm, professional handshake. I genuinely hope you accept, Mr. Voss. I think we could accomplish interesting things together if we approach this as partners rather than adversaries. And wouldn't it be refreshing to build something that doesn't require constantly looking over your shoulder for threats? They shook hands. Dante's grip, firm but not aggressive. Isa's cool and confident. Then he and Vivienne were being escorted back to the elevator, back through the lobby, back to their waiting car where Marcus and his security team stood alert. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to the airport. The SUV's privacy partition was up, but they both understood that anything said might be recorded, might be used as additional intelligence or leverage in whatever game Isa was playing at levels they couldn't fully see yet. It wasn't until they were back on the plane, airborne and heading toward home, that Vivienne finally broke the silence. That was checkmate. She had 3 moves planned ahead of where we thought we were. The documentation from Cascade Falls as the obvious lever, detective, Chen's corruption as the insurance policy, and the consulting offer as the acceptable resolution that makes refusing seem irrational or purely emotional. I thought I was disrupting her timeline by showing up early, Dante admitted, leaning back in his seat with exhaustion, finally catching up to him. But she'd already accounted for that possibility, probably had multiple contingency plans depending on when and how I made contact. So what do we do? I don't know yet. It was the first time he'd admitted genuine uncertainty, and the words felt like defeat. The rational play is accepting the consulting offer. It neutralizes the immediate threat, provides considerable income, and might actually accomplish something positive if her vision about transforming criminal organizations into legitimate businesses is genuine rather than just sophisticated cover. But it also makes me complicit in everything they've done, and everything they'll do, makes me part of their operation, instead of independent. Puts me in a position where I'm beholden to people who just demonstrated they're willing to cage someone over a waterfall to gather intelligence on tactical responses. He looked at Vivienne, seeing his own conflict reflected in her expression. And it rewards them for traumatizing you, which feels fundamentally wrong regardless of how they try to frame it as necessary intelligence gathering. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at clouds below. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful consideration of someone who'd been processing complex thoughts while appearing to just observe scenery. What if there's a third option you haven't considered? What if you accept the consulting contract, take their extremely lucrative money, and genuinely help them transition to legitimate business operations? Use your actual expertise to build something real and sustainable. And while you're doing that, you document everything. Every meeting, every decision, every instance where they slip back into criminal patterns or where legitimate business becomes cover for continued illegal activity. Build a case that's so comprehensive and so thoroughly documented that eventually you can hand it to federal authorities who aren't corrupted, not Detective Chen or anyone else in their pocket, but someone clean who can actually act on the information. It was elegant and ruthless, and exactly the kind of long-term thinking that Isa herself would appreciate. Dante felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but a sense that maybe there was a path forward that didn't require choosing between survival and principles. You're suggesting I become an informant while pretending to be a consultant. I'm suggesting you play the same game they're playing, just with a longer time horizon and a different end goal. They want to use you to legitimize their operations while maintaining control through leverage. You use them to document. their criminality while actually helping the victims of that criminality transition to legal alternatives. Everyone wins in the short term. They get real business advice that genuinely helps them. You get income and insurance against their threats. But in the long term, when you've gathered everything you need, you ensure that justice is served for the people they've hurt along the way. That's incredibly dangerous. If they discover what I'm doing, then we're no worse off than we are right now, Vivian interrupted. They already have leverage over us. They already have Detective Chen ready to manufacture cases if we don't cooperate. The consulting contract doesn't change our vulnerability, it just changes what we're doing while being vulnerable. We might as well accomplish something useful and meaningful instead of just surviving. Dante considered this, running through implications and risks with the analytical part of his mind that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous living. The strategy had merit. Genuine consulting work would be defensible if questioned. Documentation would be his own insurance policy against their insurance policy, and the long-term goal of federal prosecution would satisfy his need for justice without requiring immediate confrontation that would likely get them both killed. It could also collapse catastrophically if any single element failed, if his documentation was discovered, if Isa saw through the deception, if the federal authorities he eventually approached turned out to be compromised. I need to discuss this with Marcus, he said finally, and probably several lawyers who specialize in different areas of law, and definitely someone who understands federal prosecution and witness protection, because if we go down this path, we'll eventually need both. We have a week, Vivian reminded him, and something else to consider while you're consulting for them. They can't easily move against you without losing the resource they're paying considerable money for. It actually buys us time and a measure of protection, even as it increases our exposure in other ways. The plane began its descent toward home, and Dante felt the weight of the past days settling onto him like physical pressure. He'd started this week with a ringing phone and a missing girlfriend. He'd nearly lost everything that mattered in a cage suspended over a waterfall. And now he found himself contemplating becoming a double agent in his own criminal empire, working for people who'd traumatized someone he loved while secretly building a case to bring them down. It was complicated and dangerous and morally ambiguous in ways that made his head hurt. It was also possibly the only path forward that didn't end with either complete capitulation or mutual destruction. When we get home, he said, I want to see the painting again, the updated one with Isa added. I need to see how all the connections map out, how the various players and interests align. Visual representation might help me understand what I'm missing in the verbal analysis. I'll show you, Vivian agreed, and I'll probably need to keep updating it as things develop. This isn't over, we're just entering a new phase that's going to be longer and more complex than what came before. They landed 20 minutes later to find Marcus waiting on the tarmac with an expression that suggested new developments had occurred during their flight. Boss, we need to talk. Rothman provided more information while you were in the air. Isa Vex doesn't just have operations in Nevada, she's building a network across 6 states. She's been recruiting operators like you from different cities, offering them similar consulting arrangements to help transition criminal organizations into legitimate businesses. It's not just about the Calderos. She's building something much bigger. The implications were staggering. Isa wasn't just a criminal strategist working. For one family, she was an architect, building something entirely new. A network of reformed criminals consulting on business transformation at scale. That changes things, Dante said quietly. Does it? Vivian asked. Or does it just mean the opportunity is bigger than we thought? If she's building a legitimate consulting network staffed by people with practical experience in illegal operations, that could actually be valuable and transformative. It could also be the perfect cover for continued criminality at scale. We won't know until we're inside seeing how it actually functions. Marcus looked between them, clearly trying to understand the decision-making process. Are you seriously considering accepting her offer? I'm considering all options, Dante replied, including some that are risky but potentially more effective than the obvious choices. Give me 24 hours to think through the implications and consult with people whose judgment I trust. Then we'll decide how to proceed. They drove through the city as evening fell, lights beginning to glow in windows where families lived ordinary lives, unaware of the extraordinary decisions being made in the shadows around them. Dante watched it all pass by, thinking about choice and consequence, about the space between survival and principle where most people actually lived their lives. Somewhere in Nevada, Isa Vex was probably receiving reports about their visit, analyzing their responses, calculating next moves based on the data she'd gathered. The game was far from over, but Dante had learned something important in the past week, that being a player in the game was better than being a piece on the board, even when playing meant accepting risk and uncertainty. He pulled out his phone and began drafting notes about what a consulting agreement would need to include to be both genuine and defensible transparency requirements, documentation protocols, third-party audits, terms that would protect everyone involved while pushing toward actual transformation, rather than just sophisticated camouflage. It would be complicated. It would be dangerous. It would require trust in people he had every reason not to trust. But it might also be the only way forward that didn't end in either complete capitulation or the kind of war that would destroy everyone involved. Behind him, Vivian was already sketching in her notebook. Not the painting updates yet, but preliminary thoughts about how to document what came next, how to transform experience into art that could serve as both testimony and evidence when the time came. And somehow, despite everything, that felt like hope. 6 months after accepting Isa's offer with extensive modifications requiring transparency, regular audits, and documented reform, Dante stood in a conference room in downtown Las Vegas, reviewing quarterly reports from 3 businesses that hadn't existed a year ago. The Cascade Gallery and Hotel, a boutique property Vivienne had designed, was operating entirely within legal parameters and showing modest but steady profit growth. Occupancy had hit 78% last month, better than many established properties. Vex Logistics Solutions, using former smuggling expertise for legitimate import divided by export, had just signed its 5th corporate client, Cordis Security Consulting, employing reformed enforcers to advise corporations on asset protection, was billing at rates that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. All legal, all documented, all audited by third-party accountants Dante had personally vetted and whose integrity he'd confirmed through multiple channels. And Dante was documenting all of it. Every meeting recorded, every financial transaction logged, every decision preserved in encrypted files that were backed up in locations even Isa didn't know about. He was building a case not to destroy what they were creating, but to ensure that if the transformation stalled or reversed, there would be evidence to support federal intervention, focused on the people resisting change rather than those genuinely trying to reform. Isa Vex entered, and Dante noticed the shift immediately. Her charcoal power suits had been replaced by business casual that suggested genuine cultural shift was occurring throughout the Caldero organization. She'd cut her hair shorter, softening her appearance in ways that made her seem more approachable and less like the prosecutorial strategist she'd been. She was carrying 2 coffees, a small gesture that spoke to the more egalitarian working relationship they'd developed. The hotel hit 78% occupancy last month, she said, settling into a chair across from him and sliding 1 coffee his direction. The gallery is breaking even, which is actually better than we projected for year 1. Vivienne's curation has attracted some genuinely impressive collectors who are buying pieces at prices that make the venture sustainable. And Cordis Security? 3 new corporate contracts signed this quarter, 2 more in final negotiation stages. Turns out that skills for intimidating rivals translate remarkably well to protecting executives from external threats. The clients appreciate having consultants who actually understand how criminals think because they used to be criminals. Isa smiled slightly. Who knew that reformation could be profitable? The sarcasm held genuine satisfaction beneath it. This was working. Not perfectly, there were still Caldero operations that existed in gray areas, still revenue streams that wouldn't survive intense scrutiny from determined investigators. But the trajectory was undeniable. Legal enterprises growing while illegal ones diminished. Transformation happening incrementally but measurably. Detective Chen? Dante asked, because some threats remained despite progress. Retired early last month. Took a lucrative severance package and moved to Arizona with her family. The evidence she had on various parties, including you, was returned to proper police custody through an anonymous tip to Internal Affairs from an encrypted account. She won't be a problem going forward. Isa's expression grew more serious. I know you've been documenting everything. The audits, the financial records, the organizational changes, the resistance from old guard members who don't want to evolve. You're building a case. Dante didn't deny it. They'd moved past pretense months ago, operating in strange space where mutual surveillance was acknowledged and somehow accepted as reasonable precaution by both parties. Insurance, he said simply, for everyone involved. Smart. I'd do the same, in fact. I am doing the same. Isa pulled out her own phone, showing him documents he hadn't seen before. For what it's worth, I've been documenting too. Every meeting where we chose legal options over criminal convenience. Every instance where profit was sacrificed for sustainability. Every time, someone argued for reverting to old methods and was overruled. If you ever need to prove to federal authorities that genuine transformation occurred here, I have comprehensive evidence supporting that narrative. Why? Because I want this to work, not just as sophisticated cover for continued criminality, but actually work as a model for organizational transformation. She gestured at the reports spread between them. I spent 5 years prosecuting criminals and watching them walk free on technicalities. Then I spent 3 years helping criminals profit while staying out of prison by exploiting those same technicalities. Neither felt like actual accomplishment, just sophisticated failure in different forms. She paused, seeming to choose her next words methodically. But this building businesses that employ people legally, that contribute positively to communities, that prove transformation is actually possible, rather than just aspirational rhetoric. This feels like accomplishing something that might matter beyond our immediate survival. Her phone chimed. She glanced at it and grimaced. The old guard wants another meeting downstairs. Carlo Caldero and the senior members who don't love the new direction we're taking. They want faster profits, less patience with long-term planning. I need to manage that conversation systematically. Want backup? From the consultant they hired over their strenuous objections? That'll go over well. But she was smiling. Actually, yes. Your perspective on sustainable business models versus short-term profit extraction might be useful. They respect results more than rhetoric, and you've delivered measurable results they can't easily dismiss. They descended to a different conference room where 6 older men sat in expensive suits, expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. These were the Calderos who'd built their fortune on traditional criminal enterprise gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and drug distribution. They'd agreed to Isa's transformation strategy reluctantly, and their patience was clearly wearing thin. The Cascade Gallery and Hotel operates at 78% occupancy. Dante began without preamble, laying out financials with the confidence of someone who knew the numbers would speak for themselves. That's better than many established properties in the current market. The gallery is breaking even in year 1, projected to show profit in year 2 based on current sales trends and collector interest. Cordis Security has corporate contracts generating steady revenue. Combined, these 3 businesses employ 47 people with full benefits and legitimate paychecks. That's 47 families with stable income and 0 risk of arrest disrupting their livelihoods. But the profits are a fraction of what we made before, Carlo Caldero objected. The family, patriarch, now in his 70s, who'd survived decades in the criminal world by being smarter and more ruthless than his competitors. Why work this hard for less money? Because the money you made before came with costs you're not properly calculating, Dante countered, pulling up a detailed spreadsheet he'd prepared specifically for this argument. Legal fees for defending against charges. Bail money when operations went wrong and people got arrested. Payoffs to corrupt officials who demanded increasingly large bribes. Revenue lost when operations got shut down by raids or when product got seized. Factor in all those costs, the ones you paid and the opportunity costs of resources tied up in legal problems, and your actual profit margin was much smaller than you remember. He let that sink in before continuing. And that doesn't even account for the risk every arrest, every investigation created probability that eventually someone would flip or evidence would accumulate to the point where charges would stick. You weren't building sustainable business. You were playing Russian roulette with incrementally worse odds each time you pulled the trigger. The room fell silent as the older men processed this analysis. Carlo leaned back in his leather chair, assessing Dante with eyes that had evaluated threats and opportunities for longer than Dante had been alive. "You talk like someone who's been there," Carlo said finally. "Someone who understands both sides." "I have. I built an organization using methods similar to yours. Made good money, maintained control, thought I was secure and untouchable." Dante met Carlo's gaze directly, letting the patriarch see the truth in his words. "Then someone I love got caged over a waterfall because my enemies identified her as my vulnerability and exploited it. I learned that power without legitimacy is just borrowed time. Eventually, someone finds your weak point and uses it against you." He gestured at the financial reports. "Legal businesses have vulnerabilities too: market competition, economic downturns, and regulatory changes. But those vulnerabilities are manageable through courts and contracts and business strategy. You don't have to worry that your logistics manager is wearing a wire, or that your accountant is about to flip to save himself from a 20-year sentence. The stress is different, and frankly, it's better." Another silence, longer this time. Then Carlo nodded slowly, a gesture that carried weight in the room. 6 more months. We'll continue this transformation experiment for 6 months. If the trajectory holds, if profits continue growing, if nobody gets arrested or indicted, we'll commit fully to the new direction. But if it's not working, if the numbers don't support the vision, we return to methods we know. It was compromise, but compromise represented progress. Isa caught Dante's eye, nodding almost imperceptibly. They'd bought more time to prove the transformation was viable. After the meeting, Dante called Vivienne from his hotel room overlooking the Strip's evening spectacle. "How'd it go?" she asked, and he could hear paintbrushes clinking in the background. She was working on a new piece. 6 more months to prove this works. Could be worse. Could be better too. But 6 months is long enough to show sustainable results if we're doing this right. She paused, and he could picture her standing at her easel, considering her next brushstroke. "I'm updating the painting again, adding another panel showing the evolution over time. Art as documentation of transformation." "What does the new section look like?" "Less shadowed, more defined. Figures standing in light instead of obscurity." Another pause. "It's you, actually. 6 months ago and now. The difference is visible, not dramatic, but real." Dante understood what she meant. 6 months of consulting, of choosing legal options over expedient ones, of building instead of just protecting or destroying it, had changed something fundamental in him. Not completely. He was still capable of violence when necessary, still willing to make difficult choices that most people would find morally questionable. But his default had shifted from criminal convenience to legitimate sustainability, from taking to building something that might outlast him. "When I get back tomorrow, we should talk about what comes next," he said. "The consulting contract expires in 6 months. We need to decide if I renew or if we've accomplished what we needed to accomplish here." Among other things, her voice carried weight that suggested the conversation would involve more than just business decisions. "There are some personal matters we should discuss too. Things I've been thinking about regarding our future together." They ended the call, and Dante stood at his window watching sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and red, thinking about trajectories and transformations, and the strange journey that had brought him from a restaurant booth to this hotel room, from receiving a ringing phone to building legitimate businesses with former enemies. His own phone chimed not Vivienne this time, but Marcus with an update on Portland operations. "Everything good?" Marcus asked. "Everything's complicated," Dante replied. "But complicated in manageable ways instead of catastrophic ones. I'll take that as improvement." "Boss, you sound almost optimistic." "Don't get used to it." But Dante was smiling as he said it. He ended the call and returned to reviewing documents, making notes about recommendations for the next quarter, planning strategy for businesses that were actually legal and actually useful to the communities they operated in. 6 months ago, a phone had been found ringing in the woods, and Dante had learned that everything he'd built could collapse in hours when someone identified the right vulnerability. Now he was building something different, slower to construct, more complicated to manage, less dramatic but more sustainable. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when he'd answered that first desperate call. But it was the ending he'd chosen, and that made all the difference. In Portland, Vivian added brushstrokes to her painting, documenting transformation in the only language she spoke fluently, art that revealed uncomfortable truths and tentative hopes in equal measure. In Las Vegas, Isa reviewed contracts and financial projections, proving that idealism could coexist with pragmatism if you were willing to work incrementally toward distant goals. And somewhere in the space between legal and criminal, between redemption and recidivism, between who they'd been and who they were becoming, a group of people discovered that transformation was possible, difficult and uncertain, and never complete, but possible nonetheless. The phone had stopped ringing months ago, its battery finally dead, its message finally delivered and received. But what it had set in motion continued, rippling outward in ways no one could have predicted, and everyone had to navigate together. That was life in all its messy, complicated, occasionally hopeful reality. And somehow, despite everything, that was enough.